My parents said my brother needed the money more, so they left him almost everything. That was the sentence the advisor read from the document while the morning sun was hitting the edge of the conference table. For a moment, nobody spoke. Ethan didn't even try to hide his smile. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms like this was exactly how the story was supposed to end. The room smelled faintly of floor polish and paper files. Outside the glass wall, someone rolled a cart past the hallway. I remember staring at the numbers in front of me, because what nobody in that room seemed to realize yet was that those numbers didn't tell the whole story. We stepped out of the bank about 20 minutes later. The air outside was cooler than I expected, and the street noise hit all at once, cars rolling past, someone arguing on the corner, the distant beep of a delivery truck backing up. Ethan stretched his arms like we had just finished a routine errand. "There's a coffee place across the street," he said. "Let's grab something before we head back in." I didn't really want coffee, but I followed him anyway. The cafe was small and crowded, the kind of place where the barista calls out orders over the grinding noise of the espresso machine. We found a narrow table near the window. Ethan set his cup down and immediately started talking about the house. "I was thinking," he said, stirring his drink, "if we take down that wall between the kitchen and the dining room, it'll open the whole place up." I looked at him. "The house hasn't even been transferred yet," I said. He shrugged, like that detail barely mattered. "Well, yeah, but we both know how this is going to go." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. Outside, someone walked past the window with a dog on a red leash. The animal stopped and sniffed the sidewalk while its owner kept pulling forward. Ethan leaned closer across the table. "Look," he said, lowering his voice a little. "You've got your place in the city. Your career's solid. You're doing fine." I didn't answer. He continued, like he was explaining something obvious. "Mom and Dad knew that. That's why they set things up the way they did." The espresso machine screamed again behind the counter as someone steamed milk. For a second, the sound filled the entire room. I stared down at my coffee. Over the years, I had heard variations of that same explanation more times than I could count. When Ethan needed help with rent after a job fell through. When one of his business ideas collapsed after 6 months. When credit card bills started piling up and he told our parents he just needed a little time to get back on his feet. Each time, the reasoning sounded almost identical. "You're the stable one. You're doing well. Your brother just needs a little more support right now." At the time, it never felt like a big moment. Just another conversation. Just another small adjustment in the balance of things. Ethan took a sip of his drink and looked out the window. "You're not upset about any of this, right?" he asked casually. I met his eyes across the table, and that was the first moment that day when something inside my head quietly asked a question I had never seriously considered before. What if this wasn't just a few isolated favors over the years? What if it had always been something much bigger? By the time we walked back into the bank, the lobby felt busier than it had that morning. People moved through the room carrying folders. A couple sat across from a teller discussing something in low voices, and somewhere behind the counter a machine kept stamping paperwork with a dull, rhythmic thud. The advisor led us back into the same conference room. This time the thick folder in front of him was already open. He adjusted his glasses and looked between the two of us. "Before we finalize anything," he said, "it's important to review the historical distributions tied to your parents' accounts." Ethan shifted in his chair. "What kind of distributions?" he asked. The advisor flipped a page. "Large transfers that were made while your parents were still managing these funds." He slid a printed sheet across the table. I didn't reach for it right away. I watched Ethan pick it up first. For a few seconds, he just scanned the page. Then he placed it back down like it wasn't a big deal. "Yeah," he said. "That was just them helping out over the years." The advisor nodded politely. "That's correct," he said. "Your parents were very supportive." He turned another page. "But because these accounts were structured as part of a long-term estate plan, we have to look at the total distributions over time. The numbers started appearing one by one. 20,000, another 20, 30. There were notes next to some of them. Mortgage support, Business assistance, bills, emergency payment. The advisor wasn't reading them dramatically. He was simply explaining the records the way someone explains tax documents. But something about hearing the amounts out loud made the room feel smaller. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Those were just temporary," he said. "You know how things go sometimes." The advisor gave a neutral smile. "Yes," he said. "And your parents clearly wanted to help." He tapped the page lightly with his pen. "But when we review financial histories tied to estate planning, we look at the cumulative totals." That word hung in the air. Cumulative. I finally pulled the document closer to me. The paper was thicker than normal printer paper, slightly rough under my fingers. The transfers didn't stop after 2 or 3 lines. They continued down the page. Year after year. Some were smaller. 10,000, 15. Some were larger, 30, 40. Each one separated by months, sometimes by a year. But together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I glanced up at Ethan. He was staring at the table now instead of the document. The advisor continued calmly. "These distributions go back approximately 15 years, he said. 15 years. I felt something tighten in my chest, because suddenly the conversations I remembered from our parents' kitchen started replaying in my head. The quiet ones. The ones where my mother would lower her voice and say, "Ethan just needed a little time." The ones where my father would say helping family wasn't something you kept score of. At the time, I had believed them. I had believed it was temporary. I had believed it would balance out eventually. But sitting there in that conference room, looking at a page filled with rounded numbers and short explanations, I started to realize something that had never occurred to me before. This hadn't been random help. It had been consistent, systematic, almost predictable. Ethan cleared his throat. "So what exactly does all this mean?" he asked. The advisor folded his hands on the table. "That," he said carefully, "is what we're about to discuss." And for the first time that day, Ethan didn't look confident anymore. By early afternoon, the sunlight had shifted across the conference table, turning the edges of the papers a pale gold. The advisor excused himself for a moment to retrieve additional account summaries, leaving Ethan and me alone in the room. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Somewhere down the hallway, a phone rang, then stopped abruptly. The air conditioner hummed quietly above us, pushing cool air across the room. Ethan leaned forward and rubbed his forehead. "You're taking this way too seriously," he said finally. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked back down at the document in front of me. Now that I had seen the list once, I couldn't unsee the pattern. The transfers weren't random. They weren't occasional emergencies scattered across years. They followed a rhythm, a business idea that lasted a few months. A sudden need for help with rent, a stretch of unpaid credit card bills, another transfer, then a few quiet months, then another crisis, another transfer, another explanation, another moment where someone in the family said Ethan just needed time. I remembered a Sunday afternoon years ago at our parents' house. My father had been standing near the kitchen sink while Ethan explained why his latest project hadn't worked out. I had been drying dishes beside my mother. Nobody had raised their voices. Nobody had accused anyone of anything. My father simply sighed and said something about how starting over was part of life. A week later, Ethan mentioned that things were looking better. At the time, I didn't connect the two moments. Now, sitting in that conference room with 15 years of numbers printed in front of me, the connection felt obvious. Across the table, Ethan shifted in his chair. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "You know how Mom was. She hated seeing people struggle. That was true. Our mother had always been the first person to step in when someone needed help, but I also knew something else. She never liked the idea of keeping score. That was the phrase she used, keeping score." Ethan tapped the table lightly with his fingers. "So, yeah," he continued, "they helped me a few times. That doesn't mean anything." I glanced back at the page. A few times. The phrase echoed in my head while my eyes moved down the list again. 20,000, 30, 15, another 25, then a much larger transfer with a short note beside it housing support. I leaned back in my chair. "Ethan," I said quietly, "do you remember how long you lived in that townhouse after the company closed?" He frowned slightly, like the question came out of nowhere. "Maybe a year," he said. I nodded. I remembered visiting him there once. Boxes stacked near the wall, a folding table instead of a dining table, half-finished renovation plans spread across the counter. He had talked about turning things around soon, starting fresh, building something new. Back then, it had sounded hopeful. Now it sounded like the beginning of another cycle. The conference room door opened again as the advisor returned carrying another stack of documents. He set them down on the table carefully. "I've brought the full summary of distributions," he said. Ethan sat up straighter. "Distributions," he repeated. The advisor nodded. "These records help us understand how the overall estate was managed over time." I watched Ethan's expression carefully, because for the first time since we had walked into the building that morning, it seemed like he was beginning to understand that the story he had been telling himself about our parents' money might not match the records sitting in front of us. And if that was true, then the rest of the day was about to become much more uncomfortable for him. By the time early evening rolled around, the light outside the bank had turned softer, almost gray through the tall windows of the building. The advisor closed the conference room door behind him and took his seat again. This time, the table in front of us was covered with more papers than before. Account summaries, payment histories, a printed timeline that stretched across several pages. He placed both hands lightly on the table. "Thank you for waiting," he said. I wanted to make sure we had the full record before continuing. Ethan leaned back in his chair again, though the movement looked a little less relaxed than it had that morning. "So," he said, "what exactly are we looking at here?" The advisor slid one of the documents toward the center of the table so both of us could see it. "This is the cumulative distribution summary tied to your parents' financial accounts," he explained. "It includes the transfers we discussed earlier, along with several additional payments we located in related accounts." Ethan frowned slightly. "I already told you," he said. "Those were just times when they helped me out." The advisor nodded calmly. "Yes," he said, "and that's reflected in the notes attached to each transfer." He tapped the page once with his pen. "But when we analyze an estate, we also look at how those distributions affect the remaining balance." The room was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioning. I leaned forward to read the column on the far right. It showed totals, not individual payments. Totals. The advisor continued speaking in the same steady tone. "Over the last 15 years, the financial assistance provided to Ethan totals approximately $480,000. Ethan blinked. "That can't be right," he said quickly. The advisor turned the page toward him. "You're welcome to review the breakdown," he said. Ethan picked up the sheet and scanned it again, this time slower. The confidence he had carried all day began to slip away in small pieces. "That's not inheritance," he said after a moment. "That was just support. Temporary stuff." The advisor folded his hands together. "In many families, support of that kind is simply treated as gifts," he said. "But your parents structured these accounts as part of a coordinated estate plan." He pointed to a section near the bottom of the document. "That means prior distributions are considered when determining what remains to be divided." Ethan looked up from the paper. "So what are you saying?" he asked. The advisor's voice remained calm. "I'm saying the funds your parents transferred over the years were not separate from the estate," he explained. "They were part of the same pool of assets." For a moment, Ethan just stared at him. Then he laughed, but the sound came out thin. "That's ridiculous," he said. "Mom and Dad would never do that." I watched the advisor carefully. "They didn't see it as punishment," he said. "From the notes we have, they believed they were helping when help was needed." He paused briefly before continuing. "But financial planning requires looking at the entire picture." Ethan pushed his chair back slightly. "So what does that mean for the house?" he asked. The advisor slid another document across the table. "This summary shows the remaining estate balance after accounting for the prior distributions." I read the numbers before Ethan did. The house, the investment accounts, the savings that remained. They were no longer the overwhelming amount Ethan had been expecting that morning. Not even close. Ethan's eyes moved across the page. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. Then he looked up at me. "You went digging for this," he said. I shook my head slowly. "I asked for the records," I replied. The advisor spoke again before Ethan could respond. "These documents were already part of the estate file," he said. "Your sister simply requested a full review before finalizing any transfers." Ethan stared at the table again. Earlier that day, he had talked about remodeling the kitchen like it was already his project. Now he looked like someone who had just realized the ground under his feet wasn't as solid as he thought. Finally, he spoke again. "So, after all that," he said quietly, "you're telling me there's barely anything left for me." The advisor chose his words carefully. "I'm saying that much of what would normally be considered your share was already distributed over time," he explained. The room fell silent. Ethan looked from the papers to me and back again. For years, he had assumed the story was simple, that our parents had favored him in the end. But sitting in that conference room, surrounded by numbers that stretched back more than a decade, the story suddenly looked very different. And for the first time that day, Ethan didn't have anything left to say. The meeting ended quietly. No one slammed a chair. No one raised their voice. The advisor simply gathered the documents into a neat stack and said the remaining steps would take a few weeks while everything was finalized. Ethan stood up first. He didn't look at me when he pushed his chair back. For a second, he just stared at the papers on the table. Then he picked up his jacket and walked out of the room without saying anything. The door closed behind him with a soft click. I stayed in my seat for another moment. The advisor gave me a small, professional nod. "If you have questions during the process," he said, "feel free to contact my office." I thanked him and collected my bag. By the time I reached the elevator, Ethan was already gone. The ride down to the parking garage felt strangely quiet. The elevator hummed softly as it moved, and I caught my reflection in the brushed metal wall across from me. For the first time that day, I looked tired. When the doors opened, the smell of damp concrete and engine oil drifted in from the garage. A few cars were pulling out of their spaces, headlights briefly flashing across the gray pillars before disappearing up the exit ramp. I walked slowly toward my car. My heels echoed across the floor in sharp, hollow clicks. The entire day replayed in my head in fragments. The advisor reading the line from the document that morning. Ethan stirring his coffee across the street like nothing could possibly go wrong. The columns of numbers on the page. 15 years of temporary help. $480,000. For years, I had told myself that the imbalance in our family was just circumstance. Ethan needed help more often. I happened to be stable. That was the explanation everyone used. But standing there in the parking garage, holding my car keys in one hand, I realized something that felt both uncomfortable and strangely freeing. None of those decisions had been my responsibility. Not the money, not Ethan's choices, not the story our family had repeated for so long. All I had done that day was ask to see the records, and for the first time, the story we had all been living inside had finally been forced to line up with the numbers. I unlocked my car and sat behind the wheel. For a moment, I didn't start the engine. I just sat there in the quiet of the garage, listening to the faint ticking sound of the cooling metal in the hood, because the strangest part of the entire day wasn't the confrontation. It was the realization that nothing dramatic had actually happened. The truth had simply been read out loud. And once that happened, the rest of the story had nowhere left to hide. By the time I got home that night, the city had gone quiet in the way it only does late in the evening. A couple of windows in the building across from mine were still lit. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. Then everything settled again. I set my keys on the kitchen counter and leaned against it for a moment. The strange thing about that day was that it didn't end with a dramatic argument. No shouting, no doors slammed in anger. No one came chasing after me demanding another explanation. Just numbers. Numbers that had been sitting in those records for years, quietly telling the truth to anyone willing to look closely. For most of my life, I had accepted the role my family placed on me without ever questioning it. The responsible one, the stable one, the one who didn't need anything. But that day made something clear in a way nothing else ever had. Being strong in a family doesn't mean you have to disappear inside it. Understanding someone else's struggles doesn't mean your place automatically becomes smaller. Sometimes the most important thing you can do isn't to argue or prove a point. Sometimes it's simply refusing to keep playing the role that was written for you. And once you stop doing that, the entire story around you can start to change.